Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to understand the concept of interface in Java. An interface is the collection of abstract methods, the methods which does not have any implementation. Very similar to the abstract class, an interface also provides that first layer of abstraction where the functionality implementation is hidden from the user and we just provide the functionality details. So it is the collection of abstract methods. Let us create an interface. So to create an interface, we right click on the package name and then go to new and then click on interface. I'm going to say it as interface 1. Inside the interface, let us create a method. Let's call it as void do this, and there is no implementation. It is an abstract method. So unlike in the abstract class, we need to specify the keyword abstract before a method to call it as an abstract method. But over here inside the interface, all the methods are by default abstract. They cannot have the implementation except the static and the default methods, which we'll talk about in some time. But by default, a method is referred as an abstract method in interface. So we no need to specify that abstract keyword. So this is one of the differences in between the abstract class and interface. Abstract class can have the abstract methods and normal methods, non-abstract methods. But inside the interface, all the methods are by default considered as abstract. Exception is static methods and the default methods. Now, to use this interface, we want to implement it. A class can implement an interface. To inherit from one class to another class, we say class extends another class. So in this case, if a class wants to inherit from an interface, we will say class implements an interface, not extends. Class implements. So let's create a class and see how does it implement. I'm going to call it as class 1, and we are going to say class 1 implements interface, that is int1. And as soon as you say that class 1 implements int1, we see this compilation error, and which is saying that class 1 has to implement the unimplemented methods from the interface. So there is a quick fix which we can use to add all the unimplemented methods in one shot. So this is the unimplemented method, that is do this, from the abstract class, which is now getting override inside class 1. So whatever implementation we will provide over here, that will get executed whenever we create the object of class 1 and call this method. Okay, so interface, very similar to an abstract class, contains the collection of abstract methods which provide only the functionality details, and the actual implementation of the functionality can be inside the subclasses. Second point is, how can interface extend from another interface? Is it possible? Yes. So as we say that a class extends from another class, similarly an interface can extend from another interface. So let us create another interface. Let's call it as int2, and we say that int2 extends, not implements. An interface can never implement another interface because an interface has no way of implementing the unimplemented methods, so it can only extend, and then whatever class implements interface 2, then it can implement all the unimplemented methods from interface 1 and interface 2, etc. So for now we say that interface 2 extends from interface 1, and inside the interface 2 let's add another abstract method. Let's call it as void and do that. Okay, so we have two interfaces. Interface 1 contains a simple do this method, and interface 2 contains do that method, and interface 2 extends interface 1. Okay, now let's create another class. Let's call it as class 2, and we are going to say that class 2 implements interface 2, and interface 2 is extending from interface 1. Remember, we are going to say that class 2 implements interface 2. Again, as soon as we say that class 2 implements interface 2, it's going to ask us to add all the unimplemented methods. But in this case, not just the unimplemented methods from interface 2, we also have to add the unimplemented methods from interface 1 also, because interface 2 is extending from interface 1. So over here, when we use that quick fix, add unimplemented methods, you will see that do this got added and do that got added, both the methods. Both the unimplemented methods from interface 1 and interface 2, class 2 has to implement. Okay, this is the second point to understand. So an interface is the collection of abstract methods. A class can implement an interface. An interface can extend from another interface. This is the second point to understand. Now, unlike the class, we can have multiple inheritance possible in case of interfaces. It's a very important point and one of the strong comparison points in between classes and interfaces. In class, we cannot have multiple inheritance. A class cannot extend from multiple classes. But in case of interfaces, we can extend from multiple interfaces. Let me show you an example here. Let's create a class 3. And we are going to say that class 3 implements interface 1, comma, interface 2. It is fine, and you just need to provide another comma and provide the name of another interface. So multiple inheritance is possible. And again, class 3 just need to implement all the unimplemented methods from all the interfaces. Okay, so multiple inheritance is possible in case of interfaces. A class can implement from multiple interfaces. This is the third point to understand. Okay, so let's go back to the main class. First point was interface is the collection of abstract methods. Fine. A class can implement an interface. Fine. An interface can extend from another interface. Fine. Now, the fourth point is very important here. We are saying that non-abstract class extending from an abstract class needs to implement the unimplemented methods. So basically this is more relevant to the previous session where we were saying that an abstract class, when you extend from it, you have to implement the unimplemented methods. But if the class which is extending is also abstract, then in that case it's not needed. Similarly, a non-abstract class implementing an interface need to implement the unimplemented method which we just saw. This class 2 is non-abstract and it is implementing interface 2, so it has to implement the unimplemented methods from interface 2 and 1. Now let us say that the class 2 is abstract, so let's call it as abstract. Then in that case it is not compulsory for class 2. See, there is no error now. Because class 2 is abstract, it is not going to provide any implementation. If there is a class 4 which is going to extend from class 2, then class 4 has to implement all the unimplemented methods from the class 2, interface 2 and interface 1, because interface 2 is extending from interface 1. So let's create just an abstract method here. Let's call it as public abstract void abc, and let's create a class 4. And we are going to say that class 4 extends from class 2. Now we know that the class 2 is implementing the interface 2 and interface 2 is extending from interface 1. So class 4 has to implement the unimplemented methods from interface 1, interface 2 and class 3, which is an abstract class. So over here, if you take the cursor and add the unimplemented methods, you will see that, do this and ABC from the class 2. Everything class 4 has to implement, which is what is mentioned in the point number 5 over here, non-abstract class. If abstract, then fine, you don't need to implement. But non-abstract class implementing an interface or extending from an abstract class, needs to implement the unimplemented methods of all its all the superclasses and interfaces. Okay, now interface cannot be instantiated like abstract class. We cannot create the object of an abstract class. Similarly, we cannot create the object of an interface. It can be only subclassed or extended into another interface. 7th point says that interface does not have a constructor. Now this is an important point of comparison in between abstract class and interface. Abstract class does not get instantiated. It cannot be instantiated, but it still has a constructor. A class still has a constructor, but interface does not have a constructor at all. That's one of the important point. 9th point says, in addition to abstract methods, interface can contain static and default methods. So let's go to the interface one and let's add some static methods. So let's call it something like static void xyz, and then when we call it as static, we need to specify some implementation. So I'm going to call something like static xyz from int1. So a static method, as we all already seen, a member which is of the class, not of the object. Now in this case, there is no question of creating an object of interface. A method which is of interface itself, and also it can contain the default methods. So let's create a default method, default void uvw, and for the default method also we need to provide the implementation. Let's say in the output as default uvw from int1. Okay, the default method concept is only applicable from the Java version 8 and onwards. Default methods have been added to allow users to provide some functionality details in the interfaces if required. If required, then the user can provide some functionality details in the interface itself through default methods. Okay, and the difference in between the static and default methods is the subclass can override the default method. Static methods are of the interface itself, class itself, they cannot be override. So default methods can be override subclass, can also create the same default method, and it can provide another implementation, a different implementation. So that is the difference in between static and default method. No need to worry a lot about these theoretical details over here. Just understand that interface mostly contains the abstract methods. In addition to that, it can contain the static methods and also the default methods. The difference in between static and default here is static method cannot be overridden, but default methods can be. Okay, let's go back to the next point. It says that interface cannot have data members. Again, very important comparison point in between interface and abstract class. Abstract class can have data members, but interface cannot have data members. What I want to say is, inside the interface, if you try to create a data member, something like int a is not allowed. See, it's showing the compilation error. It is saying that you cannot have a data member. Only you can have is a final and static. If you want to create some data member, some variable, it can be only static final. And when you say something as final, you also need to initialize it. So only variables are allowed in the interface are static final. By default, they are, even if you do not specify it's at static final and you say something like int a is equal to 100, it does not mean that you will be able to change the value of a in the class where you are inheriting from this interface. Let's go to class 1, which is implementing, and let us say that let's try to change the value of a. Let us say that a is equal to 200. It's not allowed because by default a is considered as final. You cannot change its value. So by default it is static and final. Okay, that is another important point. Interface does not have any data members. All the variables are by default considered as static and final. Let's go to the next point. It says that everything is public by default. Yes, That is the reason I did not specify any access specifier over here for these methods, because everything in the interface is by default considered as public. No private, no default, everything is considered as public in the interface. So an interface can be implemented by classes or can be extended by interfaces inside the same package or inside any other packages in the project. So that was the 10th point. Okay, so let's do a quick revision. An interface can be implemented by a class. An interface can be extended by another interface. But only thing is, an interface cannot implement a class. Interface is always a super. A class can implement an interface. So a class can have interface as its parent, but interface cannot have class as its parent. That is never allowed. So that is also an important point to remember. Class cannot be a superclass for an interface. Interface can be a parent for a class, but class cannot be. Okay, that is another point to remember. So this is pretty much about the interfaces in Java, very similar to the abstract classes with the differences that we have already seen. Thank you so much for attending this session, and I would request you to keep on revising these concepts. These are the basics of OOPS, and it's very important to understand these basic concepts. Also, a lot of portion that we have covered so far is the questions around that can be asked in the interviews, and I'll talk to you with some more concepts in the upcoming videos.